Thanks, man. So, let me say, first of all, that I was filled with apprehension about giving this particular talk, although less so at the moment, because when I first proposed it to Neil, it was sort of a negative bummer of a talk about the dark sides of psychedelics. And I thought it was going to be in a side room. You know, at these conferences, usually there's a plenary talks, and then there are side events, and I thought that the 10 grumpiest people at the conference would show up, and we'd bitch and moan about how the dark sides of psychedelia, but you're condemned to have to hear it en masse, so my apologies. I know it will piss some of you off, but I've actually been pleasantly surprised at the diversity of opinions here. The panel we had last night was really interesting, I found, because there were different views, and I thought it was very civilized but fascinating. When everyone agrees, it's kind of dull, so. But don't stone me, please. You know, you can spit on me later when I'm done if you're unhappy with what I say. So, the first thing I want to say is that it's normal that because the psychedelic movement, and I hate to use it, there is no such thing as one psychedelic movement, but in order to talk, we have to generalize somewhat. So psychedelic subcultures of the psychedelic movement or the psychedelic experience are not taken seriously in our culture by mainstream sociologists or anthropologists or cultural historians. And in the popular culture, generally the only mention of psychedelics is in ridicule. You know, something like Cheech and Chong or Dude, Where's My Car? You know, stoner movies, or the jokes of late night comedians. And so it's normal that those of us who really find that these substances have been very important in our lives want to circle the wagons. So we don't want to say anything negative about psychedelics. We want to really highlight their very positive contributions to ourselves and to the culture, and that's normal. But this movement is about 45 years old now, 50 years old, since the psychedelic experience became widely known and emerged and erupted in the mid-60s. And so it's middle-aged, and when you're middle-aged, you should be able to examine yourself. You should be able to look at your shadow if you're a mature, sophisticated person. So that's what I'm hoping as a movement, or as a series of subcultures, that the psychedelic world can do, and that's what I'm proposing that we begin to look at. So, and some people have looked at that. I'm not saying I'm the only one, but I want to raise those issues. So the first point is that why is this important? Why, if psychedelics are merely this marginal, silly little, sideline of the culture, who cares what the dark sides of it might be? But the fact is that psychedelics have been far more important, and because what I'm addressing today is these socio-cultural and socio-political aspects of this. They've been far more influential in many, many ways. So I'll just enumerate a few, that some of them are painfully obvious, but obviously they contributed. Let me say, first of all, that they didn't create anything, but they enhanced and amplified many trends. And in some of those trends, they really played a significant or major role. Now, it's very obvious that they blew open the cobwebs of the culture that had gotten sterile and ossified in the 50s. And so music was obviously the most evident thing in fashions and film and art and literature and so on. Now it created some sublime examples and some rather silly ones. Yes, it produced Sgt. Pepper's. It also produced the Strawberry Alarm Clock and Bell Bottom Pants. So it's not all a wonderful story, but nonetheless, it really blew open the creativity of the culture, reaching deep in the archetypal collective unconscious to release a lot of energy that had been suppressed for a long time. Now, there are several trends that are really important in which psychedelics played a significant role that are rarely talked about. One of them is on the psychological social level, which is the shift from a nuclear family-oriented culture into one in which extended families and networks of friends became increasingly important. That tribal impulse, to use a dangerous term, but nonetheless, really got enhanced through the use of psychedelics. Then another thing is, if you look at the cyber revolution, it was soaked in LSD in the earliest days of the personal computer, and that's a tremendously important cultural phenomenon. There's a very good book on that. Well, it's not that good, but it's interesting. What the Dormouse Said by John Markoff is an interesting book that traces some of that history. On the level of eco-consciousness, I think that this is an untold story to a large extent, that many environmentalists and people who really bonded with the natural world, that was really enhanced by the psychedelic experience. And I think Dale Pendle is going to talk about that in his own inimitable, poetic way later on. in a less pedestrian and sociological way. And then the quest for spiritual, the mass quest for spiritual yearning, spiritual seeking, the opening to Eastern religions, a lot of that was radically enhanced by the psychedelic experience. There's no doubt about that. Now, one of the reasons these things are not talked about very widely in the mainstream culture, I was talking to Rick Strassman about this, is I'm very familiar with the eco world, and if you're testifying before Congress about, parts per million of pollution, you don't want to say, and this is important to me, man, because I experience photosynthesis as a plant and I know what I'm talking about. That would be an extremely, losing way to testify before experts. And by the same light, a lot of the ex-beat poets who became leaders of the Zen community, for example, and a lot of other people who went through the 50s and 60s and became spiritual figures in different spiritual movements also are embarrassed and don't like to talk about their psychedelic experiences. So it gets short shrift. So basically, to sum that section up, psychedelics were very influential and important in many ways, and they've gotten short shrift. Okay, but there's a downside, of course. There's always a downside. As someone I once knew said about the shadow, the bigger the front, the bigger the back. So one of the things about stirring up deep archetypal forces from the unconscious is that every human being in every society is always trying to seek a homeostatic balance between novelty and creativity and stability. And the same is true of a society. So if certain forces erupt much too powerfully, forces of novelty, forces of reaction seeking stability and continuity with the past will erupt also. And we're still dealing with the reaction to the 1960s. We're still fighting those culture wars in a very strong way, maybe even stronger than ever. And so that's one of the risks of eruptions of novelty, to use Terence McKenna's term, that you get a reaction. So that's one problem. Another problem is that psychedelics really, I would use the word exacerbate, but that's a loaded term, amplify, again, apocalyptic and utopian memes and scenarios and visions. Now, part of the reason for that is that they stir up deep forces from the unconscious, and those things are in the human unconscious. They're extremely strong archetypal substrates. I think every human being, this could be disputed, has some kind of secret longing for apocalypse. I once wrote this essay called Confessions of a Catastrophile. So I certainly feel it. At the same time, we don't want our lives disrupted and our friends and loved ones killed, so we also want stability. So there are these dueling forces in every human being. And at the same time, if you look at almost every religious and political ideology, there's often a template, almost universally, which is the catastrophe or apocalypse and utopia dyad. So if you take Christian fundamentalism that's marked by that's focused on the Book of Revelation, or you take Marxism, in which you have the revolution and then a transitional stage of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then the withering away of the state and utopia, or whether you take hippie New Age 2012, we'll have first this terrible tribulation and then wonderful utopia, world peace, blah blah blah. They're all the same in that regard. They all have that model of apocalypse, utopia, in this dyadic dance. Now, psychedelics exacerbate that or really bring it to the fore because the psychedelic experience is so powerful that it makes everything feel immediate. So it's not like you have this religious belief which has apocalyptic and utopian ideas and it sort of informs you, and on Sunday you think about it a little bit. This makes it feel like it's happening, man, it's coming right now. There's something about the psychedelic experience which is all about the now and immediacy. And this, can be interesting, but it's not always constructive from a socio-political point of view. The other thing about psychedelics is that they but they elicit in many, many people mystical experiences. And that can be a wonderfully positive thing, because a kind of mystical certainty is one of the aspects of psychedelics that I think in the therapy with people who, cancer patients doing psilocybin and so on, is that when people have a very powerful experiences that gives their life meaning, where they find some kind of deeper meaning and sense of connection, that can be extremely healing and a wonderful thing. But the thing about certainty, mystical certainty, is in the political realm, being absolutely certain about your beliefs can be very, very dangerous. So something that can be very healing personally can be very dangerous collectively. So these are some of the immediate issues. Now, when I look, and remember, the word utopia is an interesting word because the Greek root of utopia is sort of a dual root, but the main one is nowhere. utopia means a place that doesn't exist, and this is something that most of us forget when we get utopian. We'll get into that later. So, when I look at the landscape of the psychedelic subcultures, or to be more linguistically precise, those subcultures in which psychedelics play a role, what do I see? Well, I see some very positive things. I see the sort of beginning of an emergence of a type of spirituality that takes many, many forms, but that's eco and earth-honoring, eco-centered and earth-honoring. And I just heard a professor speak who has a book just came out, I think I mentioned it yesterday, called Dark Green Religion, that traces all these different manifestations of green spirituality, everything from surfers who are bonding with the ocean and think of it as the ocean as God, to a lot of different spiritual traditions looking for the green traces in their text, to ayahuasca churches like the UDV, and even Santo Daime, explicitly eco-conscious. It takes many, many different forms, some secular, some more religious. And I think that that's a really positive, by and large, interesting. It can take silly variations, but it's a very interesting thing. I am also seeing really a renewal of creativity in the subcultures in a less overt way than in the 60s, but a lot of do-it-yourself in my neighborhood in Brooklyn of young people, anyone under 50 at this stage for me is young, but creating incredible spaces and parties and fashions and music. And so I think there's a lot of, and I'm not saying psychedelics are causing that they're definitely a factor in there. So I see some nice trends. I also see a lot of stuff that really disturbs me. Now, the stuff that disturbs me, here's the part where people are gonna hate me, but I see a lot of, on the one hand, silly conspiracy paranoid constructs. Now, I'll get in a minute, not all conspiracies are silly, but there's a way of being into conspiracy thinking that's a black hole, and I see a lot of that. I also see a lot of silly utopianism, this idea that there's going to be this global emergence of a new consciousness and it's all going to be hunky-dory and we'll all love each other. I mean, it's a wonderful dream. It's not going to happen. Anyone who studies, human affairs and history, it isn't going to happen. So it doesn't mean that there's not a moral arc and a moral evolution and that the arc of history bends towards justice, to paraphrase MLK, and so on, but it never happens in a linear way. It's amazing how people who claim to be holistic can be unbelievably linear in some of their ideas. And then some of the other really silly manifestations are something like this obsession with the singularity and transhumanism and the extropians. I mean, some of these people are extremely bright, but one can be an extremely well-educated imbecile. Someone like Ray Kurzweil is popping 250 supplements every day and getting several transfusions and weird to achieve immortality and thinks he's going to download his brain into a computer. I mean, there's an enormous, yes, there's been a quest for immortality for eons and Taoist masters taking weird mercury concoctions and, but this is certainly no more an enlightened form of it than the worst of medieval alchemy, because medieval alchemy had some interesting aspects of it. So there's a lot of silliness going around. Now, I understand a lot of this. I share quite a lot of this silliness, and I've at different times been a true believer of some of these things, and of course I understand the quest for immortality. The terror of non-existence, that's the big terror, right? So there's anything that helps with that is understandable. And certainly there are conspiracies. Of course there are conspiracies. The human race is a conspiratorial species. There's conspiracies in high school classes at the highest level of intelligence in governments, but if you think that that there are conspiracies that rule the universe of 10 guys in a room who are omnipotent and they control everything and they've covered up everything, then you need some remedial study of history, and because that's not the way things operate, or that there are lizards from another galaxy secretly running everything. Whether or not, and if you get into any of these things, there's a lot of convincing texts, but it's a black hole. You disappear from any impact on the mainstream, which is okay. If you want to disappear into a cave, I'm yearn for that myself at times, and I might someday if there was a pretty comfortable cave somewhere I could find, you have to be clear about it. So there are mature and immature ways of approaching these things. The same is true of apocalypse. Of course there are apocalypses all the time. If you lived in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, apocalypse came. If you're living in the eastern Congo at the moment and you're in the wrong village, apocalypse is now. And so there are all regional apocalypses, and of course we all have to face that ultimate apocalypse of our own deaths, and we yearn for meaning and want to project a meaning for that. I'm not giving that as a sole explanation for spirituality at all. I don't want to be simple-minded, but yes, there are apocalypses, and yeah, maybe one day a big meteor will hit the earth and we'll all die, but so what? Then, the only thing to do is to do that old school, Brooklyn Lower East Side yoga posture, kiss your ass goodbye, so why worry about it too much? So I think we have to get more mature about how we look at these things and more sophisticated to grow up in our looking at our self-examination as a movement. And there are a lot of interesting, I don't want to condemn these things wholeheartedly. There are many interesting aspects to these things and they're fascinating, but to not just lose oneself in these belief systems. I think that's very important. All right, let me make sure. I always forget the most important thing, but Okay, so why does this worry me? As I said, if the psychedelic subcultures are not that significant, this wouldn't be so worrisome. Who cares if we have weird beliefs? But the nature of ideas is that ideas can be like homeopathic remedies. A very tiny dose, if it finds the right resonance in the right person in the right system, can have a very profound effect. Or to use another metaphor, if you take the way bacteria exchange genetic information, sometimes you get a new bacterial strain that sweeps through a population. So an idea can be started in a very small group and then suddenly spread and combine with other ideas and turn out to be very dangerous. Some very silly racialist ideas by French and British authors in the 19th century came to America and led to the eugenics movement, and then we know what happened in Nazi Germany. So ideas can be dangerous, and we are living in an extremely unstable ideological period, a very dangerous period, a bit of a frightening period. Now, part of it is because all our major civilizational institutions are in crisis. The economic crisis is, of course, exacerbating everything. And the United States in particular is an empire in decline. Now, it's still the most powerful nation in the world, there's absolutely no doubt, but it's an empire in decline, and there's nothing in the national identity that makes that easy to accept for the masses of people. So it's a real identity crisis, and so we get all kinds of abreactions and very incoherent, irrational, ugly scapegoating. Now, I'm not saying this is like Nazi Germany, not Nazi Germany, but Germany in the 1920s before the Nazis, but there are enough similarities to give one pause. I'm not saying it's exactly duplicable. So there's an extra level of responsibility that comes when you're in an unstable ideological period to not contribute to the mishigas. So in my view, the last thing we need is a bunch of apocalyptic memes floating around. So, that's one thing, If apocalypse comes, deal with it, but, otherwise, as I get zapped in 2012, I feel like a real imbecile, it's like all right, so what do I advocate we do with all this? Well, one of the things is that I think it's very important to understand and to delve more deeply into the nature of what archetypal material is, the stuff that is stirred up by psychedelics so profoundly. Now, my view is that you can use whatever words you want, the id, the unconscious, the collective unconscious. Who knows? Other intelligences, I think no one really knows, but incredibly interesting stuff gets stirred up. The problem is I don't think anyone can fully control it. So that's where some of the dangers come in personally. I think that tripping's not for everyone. I think people with a lot of preparation are healthy, don't have a history of schizophrenia in their immediate family. There are a lot of, it can be very dangerous because any powerful tool, by definition, can be dangerous. So, but understanding that this archetypal material it can't be fully controlled. One can certainly benefit by visiting those realms with the proper preparation, but don't think you can control it or own it. In those cultures in which there's a long history of use of plant medicines, and I'm not holding them up as some model, there's a lot of dark sides to shamanism, but they're much more sophisticated than we are. We're very simple-minded and literal and linear in our we're a very advanced technological culture. We're not a very advanced psychological culture. So those cultures, the shamans, they understand that these are trickster substances. My friend Jeremy Narby said a shaman told him, ayahuasca can be the biggest liar in the world. And this is one of the problems with psychedelics. Their very nature is they're amplifiers. So they can amplify creativity, they can amplify bullshit. They can give us, the Beatles enhancing their creativity when they did Sgt. Pepper's, or the Stones with Satanic Majesties, and then they can lead to someone who was a big Beatles fan, Charles Manson, was doing a lot of acid. So they don't give us, a positive result. They're complex substances. They're tricksters. And they might have their own agenda. I don't know, whatever that means. So you have to honor and have a lot of humility, and don't be in a rush to interpret what comes up. I mean, I'll give you a personal example. I've almost always had snake visions whenever I've done any of these substances. And often the same jewel-encrusted giant king cobra, which is very terrifying. And eventually I sort of made peace with it and said, okay, what do you want? But if I were slightly less, neurotic and self-critical and worried person, I would say, I am the apostle of the snake goddess, join my cult, you know what I mean? Obviously, in the cold light of day, that would be a very, very bad idea, would not contribute to the sanity of the social situation, So I'm just saying, we have to be very careful not to get overly literal. And I think that Jung's work with archetypes is extremely important to think about. One of the things that Jung said is that one of the most dangerous things, perhaps the most dangerous thing that can happen to a human psyche is to be possessed by an archetype. And now what that means, and now this is very, very tricky territory, because we all need to be informed by archetypal material. If you're not, your life is extremely flat and soulless. So you have to dip into the collective unconscious, which psychedelics certainly helps one do. But if you get possessed by an archetype, then for one thing, it's very damaging personally, but it can be very damaging socio-politically, because what happens is that some of people who are possessed by archetypes become extremely charismatic, filled with energy and certainty, which is very attractive for most of us who are worried and not certain about anything and ambivalent and, oh my God, this person must know something. And in the wrong set of circumstances, when archetypal forces that are paranoid and are roiling through the population, some of those figures can become sort of vortices and points of attraction, and with very dangerous results. So having a certain humility and understanding that the archetypal stuff being dredged up is complicated. Honor your experience, but don't rush to interpret it. That's my advice. Let me talk about a few people who've thought about this profoundly and have some interesting things to say about it. As I was saying, the trick is to be informed by archetypes, but not possessed by them. Now, it's a delicate dance. Now, Aldous Huxley talked about this, is that human beings needed to be multiple amphibians. And what he meant by that is that we have to be able to walk on the dry land of rationality and to swim in the deep waters of the mythopoetic unconscious and, realm. Now, obviously, the danger, I was just thinking of this sci-fi movie from the 50s, Forbidden Planet. And there's, it's, I think with Walter Pidgeon and Anne Francis. Anyway, there's Robbie the Robot is the most famous character. But anyway, there's a monster killing all these astronauts, and it turns out that it's one of the main characters, monster from the id. His fears about losing his daughter have created this sort of unconscious monster that has become an energy field. So there's something about the archetypes. I was thinking about the monster from the id that can be very dangerous. But what Huxley is saying is we have to do this delicate dance of combining rationality with the unconscious, that as a balanced human being. My friend Jeremy Narby, who has really spent a lot of his life thinking about about shamanic knowledge and scientific knowledge, talks about it as being bicognitive. Now, I would go further. I would say we need to be multi-cognitive, or what I would call multi-perspectival, that the postmodern condition demands of us that we be able to put on different lenses, but with exquisite appropriateness, that we know when I'm doing my taxes, I put on my rational lens. When I'm, communing with nature in the woods naked, I put on my archaic lens, but don't mix them up. Don't mix them up. There's a great, one of my favorite Ram Dass stories or anecdotes or it's not even an anecdote, it's more like a joke, he says, if you live in a communal situation and you're all sort of believe that part of the thing that brings you all together is that you believe that all is one in your spiritual community. But then you have a list of who does the dishes on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So it comes your turn to do the dishes on Monday, and you say, hey, why don't you do the dishes? We're all one. What difference does it make? And he talks about that as being mixing up the layers, the levels of life. You have to honor each level of life fully and not jumble them all up. And I know that's hard because we want to be holistic and unitive, and the personal is the political, and it's all one. Yeah, yes, but no. Everything's a paradox. So we need to become more comfortable with unknowing, with paradox, with confusion, at the same time holding on to an ethical center and to some, we can't be total relativists. This is a trick. It's hard. And this is why I think so many of us, and all of us in our own way, again, I share a lot of these superstitions and irrationalities. I'm not condemning anyone, is that life's a bitch, and doing it right and walking that line, but being a multiple amphibian or multi-cognitive, it's hard. You can never do it completely successfully. So this is the challenge of being adult. And the problem with psychedelics is that they don't lend themselves to lucidity and common sense. That's not their job. So I'm not advocating that we stop taking, that those of us who can do productive work with them shouldn't stop taking them if they don't want to. But try to, when you return to the realm of sociopolitics and doing the dishes, that maybe you go vote for the party that's lame and awful, but not for the evil lizards from another dimension who are so crazy. If Torquemada is running, I don't care who the other candidate is. So that is an example of not being utopian but pragmatic. And I think we have to, all of us, learn to combine our utopian side with a pragmatic side. And the problem with psychedelics is it doesn't lend itself to pragmatism. So those of us who are going to go deeply into these realms, I think, have a special responsibility to digest our experiences, give it time, not be in a rush to interpret, and to try to bring it into some kind of balance so that we're not contributing to the chaos and incoherence and irrationality of the world, but instead we're drawing on those powerful experiences in a centered way that's going to be useful for our culture, which is in this very, very difficult phase. So I think I'll leave it at that and answer some questions.
Microphone, thank you very much. All right, some questions or comments?
Don't we sort of need the fringes a little bit to give us places to look?
Yes, absolutely. This is the hard thing of making an argument like this, is that, don't get me wrong, psychedelics have been incredibly important in my life. I can't really imagine having lived without taking them. And of course we need the fringes. The fringes is where a lot of the most creative work gets done, and where ideas that are going to revitalize and rejuvenate the culture are going to come from. And by their very natures, fringes are fringe, so you get a lot of uncentered, and sometimes overly exuberant manifestations. That's fine. The danger is when the fringe becomes less a healthy spawning ground for ideas and becomes a viral infection or a bacterial. I'm mixing so many metaphors, it's pathetic. But that's where I would come down. There's no easy way to control any of these things. It's not like anything I say is going to change anything. But I do have a healthy respect for the fringe. We're all fringe. Let's face it. By mainstream cultural values, this is a flake gathering. Even a somewhat cerebral pessimist like me is a total flake compared to them. So there are degrees of fringeness, I guess.
Other questions? Right up there. Excuse me.
Hi, I've really enjoyed both these talks greatly today. And one thing I've observed is that the focus seems to be on post-World War II or foreign cultures. And I'm wondering, I've read a lot about the use of laudanum in the 19th century among artists, poets, musicians, and I'm wondering, first of all, what happened to it, and maybe if you could if you could expound upon that.
So you mentioned laudanum, is that right? Yes. Or Well, I think for one thing, the substances are very important. For instance, I would not include MDMA in what I was saying because the true psychedelics are not predictable. That's one reason the CIA, by the way, gave up on using LSD in the mid-50s. That very good book by Martin Lee, Acid Dreams, traces that history because it wasn't predictable. Whereas something like MDMA can be, I think, used therapeutically more predictably. Something like laudanum and opiates and, absinthe, I think, Dale Pendle's a great expert on absinthe if you want to find someone who really knows the 19th century scene really well. It's not a true psychedelic. I mean, you can get in definitely interesting altered states. There was some use of mescaline in the late 19th century, Havelock Ellis and some of those circles. And the hashish scene in Paris with Théophile Gautier and Baudelaire and a lot of these, even Balzac, a lot of these people, was really interesting. And hashish can be psychedelic. So, I think that's an interesting study. I mean, there's been some stuff written about this in German and in French and a little bit in English. But
I'm thinking even earlier, like E.T. Hoffmann, Schumann, Mary Shelley.
Right.
These people, they were producing rather extraordinary things that...
I think that the Romantic era is very important in terms of informing a lot of the nature consciousness and a lot of our ideas. And the story of the Romantic movement is a really interesting one because it took so many forms, and some of the Romantics became Nazis, some of them became holists. Obviously it's deep material to get into, and one can often trace the antecedents of cultural movements. You can go further and further back. I mean, you can find ancient Greeks who were Dionysian hippies, and there's some very interesting work that Peter Lamborn Wilson did many years ago about the earliest days of America, where you had sort of some of the earliest fur trappers, and then the people at Jamestown who intermarried or didn't intermarry, but partied with Indian lasses and danced around the maypole, and then Miles Standish and the militia came and quashed them. And the sort of the earliest strains between the hippie, nature-loving party animal and the repressive Puritan goes back to the earliest days. So one can often trace back one's cultural antecedents very far and find interesting things. But I think for the stuff I'm talking about, really the 1960s is the focal moment where it explodes. And that's what I was mostly focused on. But that's definitely interesting material, and I love a lot of that work. And I mean, Frankenstein, she was, 17 years old when she wrote that? Unbelievable. I mean, it's incredible. Mary Shelley, all right.
Sure. Hi, thank you. I'm going to try and frame this a little bit. It's always hard to get my head around what I actually want to ask, but I think that you're on a balance beam, which I really appreciate. You're really talking about something important culturally. I'm curious about how you might bring in the visionary dynamic, which, given where we're at, seems to be an important component. I understand that you're not advocating complete disappearance of the voice, but I'm wondering how you would bring it out in a responsible manner.
I mean, these are great questions. I mean, this is obviously, I do not have the answer, to anything. The older I get, the fewer answers I have to even mundane problems. But clearly, I think the visionary experience enriches human life, and again, without it, I can't. And I'm a sucker for the beauty of I'm an aesthetic junkie. I mean, some of the religious traditions say, oh, that's all childish and returning to the womb and the oceanic state. I say, fuck it. I want as much joy and pleasure. Life's a bitch and suffering and hard. Take your austere religion and shove it. I mean, it's like, even though I have a lot of respect and I practice a lot of that stuff and I still meditate a lot, but I'm just saying. So, by all means, explore these realms. The problem is integrating it. And socially, the difference between, of course, we each want to cultivate is the depth of our own potential in a visionary sense, in a creative sense. I think each human being's primary responsibility is to be the fullest example of who you can be in terms of the depth of your experience and the richness of your experience. And if that involves the visionary state, all the better. The problem is when we take some of these mythopoetic things and then convert them in a linear sense into facile, simplistic socio-political ideas. That's the edge that I'm trying to, But I don't know how you stop it. Nothing I can say is gonna, change anything. But it's good to explore,
Well, in the interest of time, we're going to call to close. Please help me again thank JP.